So I'll get started just with a round of intros. Obviously, we have Martin Splitt here from Google. Martin, thank you so much. We have Tomek Rudzki, so head of research and development at Onely. He's more or less the reason we're here. So thank you so much, Tomek. And yeah, let's get this started. So it officially begins. So boom. Hello and everyone. Hello and welcome everyone today. We're gonna talk today about rendering and indexing because those are very closely connected, and we're gonna talk about that with Martin Splitt from Google. And there's a little bit of story why Martin is here today, and I couldn't be happier that he agreed to join us. So I'm just going to very briefly say why I'm so happy that Martin is here, why it's actually very important for SEOs. So we sometimes, as SEOs, especially we here at Onely, look at things from opposite perspectives, from two sides of one problem, but we have the same goal. We want to make the web a better place. And Martin was always extremely helpful, and he's going that extra mile. I'm assuming he's risking trouble, but he says he doesn't. So I'm gonna take his word for that to explore those new topics that may push Martin out of his comfort zone. But again, the goal here today is to have a friendly conversation, not to push each other to any uncomfortable places, and basically to help you guys make a better website. So anything you wanna add, Martin, before we move forward?
I think one thing to add is it's not so much a question of if I am like breaching any NDAs or saying anything that isn't correct or isn't okay to say publicly. The big risk that I'm taking, I'm really excited to talk about this because I think rendering is one of the things that is least understood in the general SEO world. It is quite important to understand it these days. But the risk is, this is complex, this is very technical. So the risk here is that the three of us geek out on things and say things that do not 100% make sense to you or seem to be making sense, but are actually a little out of people's depth. And then you might get the wrong ideas, or I might actually create more confusion than removing confusion from the situation. So in the questions and answers, please ask away. I will look at the questions afterwards as well and try to see if we need to document things better or if there is a follow-up that I can produce in the documentation or on the blog, or if I rejoin the next webinar. I probably can rejoin the next webinar as well, just so that we make sure that we are on the same page and there's no miscommunications. And please, if you are not sure about something and you're writing an article about these things, ask before you publish an article. And that's not just to them, that's just like to the entire internet, because it can cause us orders of magnitude more stress to remove misinformation than to avoid misinformation. So that's all I'm saying on that end.
I'm sorry, I was only laughing.
Oh, Barry! I saw Barry in the chat.
Yeah, I saw that too. So Barry will make a very good article for together about that. But I'm laughing because we are a very good case study of reaching out to Martin with a lot of difficult topics actually. And I can tell you straight up firsthand that Martin is not avoiding those difficult topics, and even if he is, and I can feel that sometimes a little bit of tension in the DMs, he's going that extra mile to help us out. So without any further ado, I want to go through some of the slides from last week that actually caused this conversation, and want to talk about an awkward topic of HTML indexing. And we went through these findings from our toolset that I'm not going to get into. We're going to have an in-depth webinar about that next week. But there are some brands out there that are not indexing Google, and indexing HTML, something that we always assumed is a given, is not that easy anymore, or is not something we can be 100% sure of right now. And some of the indexing trends fluctuate during Google updates. I'm 100% sure that Martin is not going to tell us anything about this part. And you can get kicked out of Google's index, something that Gary recently mentioned. So with this in mind, what's the deal with all the indexing issues? And can you elaborate about that a little bit more, Martin, if you could? So how do I begin this very complex topic without causing confusion? So
we recently
go.
had indexing issues.
Yeah?
We had indexing issues in the last couple of months, if I remember correctly. We did have 2 large indexing issues last year. So yeah, I think that's a legitimate question. Where does this come from, and why are there these indexing outages? We do have a blog post on the outages from last year where we explain what happened. And if I remember correctly, the long story short, there was an infrastructure migration. We migrated from one version of the infrastructure to a new version of the different systems and infrastructure. Something in the update didn't quite go well. And then we had the issue that we were lagging with indexing for a couple of hours, I think. And that wasn't helpful. That wasn't great. There are different. The interesting thing is, even though we can't say that much about the indexing issues specifically that happened in the recent past, they are all caused by different things, and they are all caused by different systems involved, and they are all caused by different situations causing them. And there isn't that much actionable from your side. It is a thing that we are constantly working on improving. We are constantly working on improving our communications around this. I know that a few people have literally, just as we are recording this webinar, reported indexing issues. We are looking into what's happening. I don't know if anything is happening. It can happen. And actually, we're discussing this in the second episode of the podcast, which is hopefully in a couple of weeks coming out for everyone to watch. But I can say, like, Gary explains a lot more and in much better detail than I can what has been going on there specifically. But fundamentally, we are working on figuring out better ways of quicker finding these things than just either automated systems triggering things quite late in the process, or someone only finding out after investigating because there are public mentions of these issues. It does happen that we get like public reports and then we check and then the monitoring looks okay, but then you dig in and look at the right combination of numbers and you see like, ooh, this combination of numbers is off. It isn't what it's supposed to be. And then you can like figure out what's happening. We try to improve that, but there isn't one cause that keeps repeating itself. So that makes it quite hard to predict if this is happening again, when is this happening again. We can only say we're doing our best to keep our infrastructure running. And I mean, it has been running relatively smoothly for years and decades. It's IT systems, it is complicated. Things go wrong from time to time.
One question, Martin. Basically, I can understand that there are some anomalies, but we are talking about everyday indexing.
Okay, sorry. In that case, I misunderstood the question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So basically, that's true that Google doesn't index every page on the web. And according to our statistics, Bartek, can you show that? There are many big websites like Yux, Verizon, even Bright that really struggle with indexing. And it's not only related to these indexing bugs you are talking about, but also about how Google works, how the web works, like the web going bigger and bigger.
Sorry, I misunderstood the question. I thought this was specifically about the like outages. This case,
actually, both those topics are very interesting, so don't worry about that.
Okay, that's great. But coming back to the question that Tomek actually wanted me to answer, that's a tricky one. And the thing is that ignoring these specific brands, if you look at how people build websites, you sometimes have people saying like, I have this website with 500 billion URLs. Why are there only 1,000 of them indexed? And then I'm like, right, let's have a very brief look. And then you find out, okay, so actually there is 1,000 actually different and interesting things, as in like good content pages. And all these others are small variations of it. So they either get canonicalized away from it, or they are very thin on content, Or maybe it's like, okay, so we have all these products, and then we have this category URL that you are having in your sitemap. But why would we put the category in if we have the individual products? And people are probably more likely to search for the individual products rather than the categories. So we might not select the category pages to be included, even though they are unique content and they are good content. They might not be good content in the sense of that we think it's index worthy, if that makes sense. And this is actually a really, really tricky one for us as the people who communicate with the community, because there are people who build websites. I recently had a case where someone built a website that they think is fantastic. And I think it is fantastic. It is just of questionable value, because what they did is they just pulled data from multiple sources and put it in one place. But we have the data of all these individual sources already. And there are other websites that also pull the data in from multiple sources. So the only difference is visual appearance or something. And then I'm like, the website is good. Like, you didn't do anything wrong per se. It's just that we found, well, we have this information already from elsewhere, and we even have this kind of compilation of information already elsewhere. So why would we spend time and ranking effort and indexing effort on this page if the outcome is very likely to be not better than what we have already, unless we find out that your website does something fundamentally so much better that there is a chance to actually be useful.
So that being said, I completely agree, and we're seeing, where did Martin go? Yeah, and we're seeing exactly what you said. So we're seeing that problem of, for example, Walmart. He said, I know you want to talk about the brands, but I can do that. So we're seeing, for example, for Walmart.com, they have tons and thousands and thousands of not available anymore products in their sitemap. They're indexable, they're unique, but they're not available
useful
anymore.
Yeah.
And I can see that Google is actually ignoring just those ones. So there has to be some kind of heuristics to do that. That's one. But the second problem, and I know this is tricky for you to address this because this is so complex. So we're gonna try to go through this one without causing more problems. And bear with me, I'll do my best. So we're seeing a lot of websites struggling with partial indexing. Let's not go after any specific brand because that's going to make it so much more difficult for Martin to reply to this question. So some pages will have only a bit of their content indexed. For example, they'll have their main product indexed, main product description indexed, but they will not have the, I'm looking for a slide with that, they won't have the similar products or something like that index or maybe rendered by Google. And what we actually struggled with some of our clients with this problem. And so from the very top, partial indexing seemed very banal for us, like something that we shouldn't worry about as much, because the content that Google is usually not indexing wasn't that essential. So that's one. But now getting to the end of this wonderful story is that once we addressed those partial indexing problems, Google started crawling that website a little bit more and indexing more URLs, because sometimes those partial indexing problems, and that's very often, those partial indexing problems are only a sign of a much larger issue with the whole structure. So can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit more within your comfort zone?
Right. I'll try my best. So I'll prefix this with a warning saying that I don't have the exact heuristics. I don't have the exact bits and pieces in my head how exactly it works. So I'm operating on what I know our systems generally do, and I operate on what I know to be true about this specific question. I'll say that when we look at content, so when we have crawled and probably also rendered, and then we look at the content that we're seeing, not each piece of content is equal. quite obviously. So we do understand, semantically understand, oh yeah, this is an important piece of content. This is kind of like overhead, what do you call it, boilerplate, whatever. This is a menu. This seems to be like some sort of navigation. This seems to be some sort of footer. This seems to be an area where user-generated content is loaded. And we understand what we think is the main content. That happens. That generally happens. And we do understand if content is repeated, as in like we understand like, oh, okay, so this piece here is written to the index. So that, right, the indexing stage is actually taking the content, processing the content, and then potentially writing it into, let's say, like a database for simplicity.
So you're looking at the content that's already rendered, and you're just deciding whether to index that or not. Okay.
Yeah. So that does happen, and we do have some very coarse classifications. So we can also say, like, from looking at the entire page, this looks like it is not very helpful, or this is not very useful in content here. And then we might decide not to continue processing it. So like we in after rendering, we take the rendered result and we go like, interesting. So this is pretty much just an image that we happen to already have in the index, and like a one-sentence description, which is also the alt text of the image on the other page that we have in the index. So this page isn't useful, isn't good. And then we just do not write it to the database. Even though we have looked at it in indexing, we might decide like the value of putting this into storage, so to speak, is minimal. So no, we don't do that.
And you used that example a while ago when you said that if the website is about cats and like let's say there are dogs underneath that, you may skip that as well. And that's something that we often see with no cookies on some of the e-commerce stores. You're looking at running shoes and they are proposing you a barbecue grill underneath. Because they're very closely related.
Yeah.
So we see those sections being very often skipped by Google. So this is, we can assume, maybe something you do on purpose.
This is also interesting because this gets us into the area where we enter ranking, because we might still index the page for okay, so this is a page about running shoes. Great. So here's a running shoe, a very specific running shoe product. And then there's like a bunch of stuff below it. So we can say like the main content of this page seems to be about this specific running shoe. And then there's this other noise down here. And then this noise is actually mentioned or is like stored. The page then is stored as an entire thing, but it wouldn't necessarily show up for what we consider noise on the page. But that's as much as I know about ranking. So I won't go into more detail. I just know that the indexing system takes annotations for these things.
Okay.
By the way, we noticed that commonly Google doesn't index a section with related items. That can be possible as a result of, let's say, the related items are not really related. And my thinking about that is when your system is not presenting related items really related, you not only lose your clients because they don't want to buy it, but also Google is noticing, okay, it's not related, so you skip that.
It's definitely possible that we would skip these things. And also, yeah, I mean, if you think about it, if a website is clearly about thing A and then has some noise about thing B that is unrelated, then how would we reasonably represent that in search results?
Also, just to add something that's completely not related to the main topic, but very interesting to you, Martin, I think to the audience as well, is that we very often see now that a lot of websites, you know what I'm talking about when a lot of websites do the page rank sculpting thing. I'm using air quotes just so if anyone is listening to that, air quotes. So they do that to index more pages within a lot of like those thin content-y kind of websites. And you skip those very, very often now, which makes me kind of laugh at the whole concept, because in the past, it actually worked toward indexing those extra pages, like pushing Googlebot to visit a little bit more. But now, not only you don't visit those, but often you don't index those at all. So So this is, sorry,
That
just a
is
funny
possible.
thing.
No, but that's very, very likely possible. Another thing is that I think Gary said that publicly as well. If we are basically like constantly, how do I put this nicely? We are pretty much constantly reevaluating. I have to be careful with my words here because I don't want to like cause confusion at this point. But basically, whenever we crawl and then the pipeline runs for a page, so we crawl, we render, and then the indexing system takes over, it evaluates the page. It looks at how the page has been in the past as well, but it also looks at the current status quo of the page. And that makes sense. If the page is now a 404 page, which isn't an actual so soft 404 page, so it comes through like, oh yeah, this is a page, and then indexing looks at it. This only says page not found or article no longer available. Then it can drop this, right? It drops this carefully. It is not like once we see this, we kick it out immediately. But if we keep seeing that over a period of time, this page seems to be not as useful, then the indexing system might do a different decision. It might decide, actually, I don't think this page is useful anymore, and then remove the page from the indexing. So something that is in the index can be evicted. That does happen.
So we're seeing that quite often. Again, with expired products, you guys are very good at that because in the very beginning, we saw websites that again are 40, like I think Walmart stats are somewhere around 30-40% of what we're scraping from their sitemaps. We're not finding that index, and we're seeing that those products are in many cases, we don't have the exact statistics, but when I open those, they're in most cases no longer available or not in stock. So we're seeing a very strong heuristics towards that.
Yeah.
But moving forward, if you, Ziemek, could show the screen for 1 second, I just wanted to ask one question about interrupting scripts, which is something, I think this is your slide, by the way.
No, it's not my slide.
Okay, but just if you could elaborate, because I had some wild theories, probably some of those were, so what we're seeing, sometimes these are like one of those is directly from like Google patents and your statements. So you interrupt scripts if they're too heavy on the computing power, let's call it that, side of things. But isn't that when you see a website or a page that's very heavy on the scripting side, even more than rendering, just scripting, you will ignore some of the scripts just to save resources if you see that, for example, they are responsible for similar products?
Okay, so generally there isn't any like fancy logistics or fancy heuristics in place for this. Generally speaking, we request decide how your browser would request it. There are, however, two interesting caveats. One is we very heavily cache scripts and other resources. So like we do cache your CSS, we do cache your scripts, we do cache your images, we do cache these things. And actually images is even more interesting because for the web main indexing, for like the search, regular search indexing, I'm not talking about Google image search. Image search is different. But for the regular web index, we are not actually requesting the images. We know they exist and they have an alt text and they have text around them, but we don't have to download the image file because when we are rendering, we are not really interested in the pixels that come out. We're interested in what's called the layout tree. Yes, so that's one caveat. The other caveat is that we do have a list of scripts that we know not to be useful for rendering, such as Google Analytics or certain other analytics trackers and certain ad scripts that we don't need to load. If we know them for sure to not contribute to the page content, and that means we have to be absolutely sure about this. And this is more a manually maintained list than like an automatic process or an automatic heuristic, then we might skip these scripts, yeah.
See how quickly I did the slides, even quicker than you in Munich when you created the whole deck within 30 minutes. I'm just so talented. Anyhow, we're just talking about those mock images, and we're going a little bit off track, but I will get to that in a second. What we're seeing that if some of the images return a 404 and just disregard this brand here, we're seeing a layout shift. So a layout shift. If there are no image dimensions in the code, and your image for any reason is not available, which happens quite often when we test different websites. Not sure if you're seeing that on your end as well. Would you say that this may cause problems? So layout shifts due to images not like returning a 404, which I think is often visible in Search Console, and no image dimensions in the code. What do you do to generate layout then?
Well, I mean, in that case, we can still generate the layout. Hold on. What's the situation? Because I'm not sure what you mean with like do not return a 404.
The image, an image is gone. You cannot request the image. It's returning a 404, and you don't have image dimensions. So the whole layout is broken.
Right.
And this is something we're trying to figure out. We had that case with one of the clients. It took a while to figure this out, but one image was returning a 404. The whole layout was shifted.
Right.
Sometimes it's very, very broken. It wasn't H&M, by the way. Just this is an example.
Fair. Generally, that doesn't hurt that much because yes, sure, everything shifts a little bit and looks weird, but normally the semantic mean like a large block of text that contains everything that is on the page and then only like a few images and menus around it. Even if that looks broken, it's still quite clear what the main piece of content is on that page. We can also look at the HTML to understand like, oh, so this is actually the main piece of content. And here's where all the important bits and pieces are that we care for when it comes to what this page is about. It can cause interesting problems though if you are wondering, let's say like if the content layout is really, really broken and so certain parts of content aren't visible, as in literally like visible on the page, we might think that there is a reason that you're hiding this content. So we might think this is not as important as content that is visible. But that is an edge case that I would say does not hurt as much as people might think. Generally speaking, it's not an issue. It is just not great. So I would try to fix this as I could.
But that's very interesting because we've built these tools that you know that because I know that Tomek was talking about the results from TGIF last year. But anyhow, we're seeing that some of the websites, some of very big brands, they block JavaScript. Still, in 2020, they block JavaScript. And the whole part of their layout is not indexed in Google because sometimes you actually respect those robots directives. So it's funny with Google. We never know if those are really gonna be respected. So you're saying that this is not that big of a deal. Like how?
I mean, so to be fair, if we are having a hard time to identify what content is really important and central to the page to begin with, then yes, this makes it even harder for us because we can't judge based on the fact where things are on the page visibly. But if you have a solid technology base, that means semantic HTML that works, that all content is actually there and not for some reason behind an API that you're blocking from Googlebot, and there's no other big problems that could hurt us while we are trying to access the page, then it shouldn't make that much of a difference because people do hide content quite often. There are like tab boxes and carousels and accordions and stuff like that. So it would be roughly treated like that probably, unless obviously the semantics of your page are so screwed up that this is the icing on the cake and then completely throws us off. But I haven't seen a case like that so far.
Okay, so my last question to you, Martin, and we're gonna take one from the audience. So Ziemek, start picking the best question from the comments. So my last question is something we're seeing as this vicious cycle. Something we talked about with you last year. I wanna just. I'm not sure if you can elaborate on this, but let me walk you through that. So we're seeing that, for example, you have heavy code or you're blocking part of the JavaScript, part of your layout is not indexed. This is causing a lot of, obviously, crawling and indexing problems because Google is struggling to find new content or is, again, running against very, very heavy scripts every single time. And obviously, after fixing basic things like information architecture and all those basic like indexing strategies, so we're not serving all that nonsense to Google as well, how can webmasters start addressing that? What would you advise them as a first step to stop that vicious cycle of poor code rendering issues, partial indexing, bad indexing, and because it basically it's a domino effect of all those things happening.
It is. I think that honestly, the very, very first step for me would be to monitor my site for things that look off. Like if you have pages that are very important for your business and they have good quality content and they're not showing up, then I would start with going to the tools and figuring out what is Google seeing. And when I say seeing, I don't mean the screenshot in the mobile friendly test on the URL inspection tool. What I mean is the rendered HTML. How does the rendered HTML look like? And if you are having a hard time in the rendered HTML, maybe after like cleaning it up a little bit, because HTML can be quite compressed. But if you have like a clean version of the HTML that we rendered, and you look at it and you have a really hard time finding your content, or your content doesn't look like it's properly marked up with proper headlines, proper links, proper structure and proper information architecture, then that would be where I would first start. Have the content solidly ready. And then in the second part, look at if this content arrives at our end, at Google's end, correctly as well. And then basically start digging into problems one by one.
But just to elaborate on that a little bit more, and I'm gonna be pushing you, Martin, just a tiny bit. If you have a website or page that's partial indexed, there is no tool from Google that will show you it's partial indexed. That's the whole paradox. We've built our toolset by a total accident, and we were seeing that because we did it. But this is very difficult to scale. If you wanted to give TGIF to websites to people, like what would you do?
So the tricky thing is, okay, I haven't addressed this yet, but I'll address this, and I hope that I'm not pushing back too hard. If I push back too hard, let me know.
It's fine.
I let partial indexing fly because I am lacking a better term for it. Technically speaking, there is no such thing as partial indexing. We're indexing a page. We're indexing all the content. We might judge different parts of the content that we index differently. We might say this page is for A and also somehow for B, like topic A is definitely the main thing, and then there's topic B and somehow also topic C here somewhat in there. But we're indexing it all, but we are kind of like labeling it as this is definitely for A, which means that it's not showing up for B and C. It is indexed completely, but it doesn't show up for all of this content. I know that there's nothing in the tools. Again, sorry if I didn't want to like step on anyone's toes, but that's kind of the situation.
That's fine.
That I'm like trying to figure out here. And the thing is, before people plot this differently, we're in this together, right? We are having like a constructive dialogue because I am excited to finally be able to talk about more advanced things as well. But at the same time, we are also pushing the knowledge boundary here a bit. And the reason why there is no tool that shows you these things properly is that we would give away a lot of things that can be used to game the system. And if we do that...
Just to pause for a second, Martin, just to make it clear, I said multiple times that we'll never gonna get this information from Google because after spending hundreds of hours reading into that, it's just so complex that even if you wanted to give one element, you need to explain 50 others, and then it's basically laying out the algorithm, which is not, again, like it's also, I'm guessing a little bit machine learning heuristic is changing every day. So I get that. Just to make it very clear, I get that. Just wanted to hear your point of view here.
Yeah. So I know that we don't have a good tool to show you if your content is all over the place. That is true. I don't think we will have a tool like this anytime soon. But I think if you look at it, you also have to actually be honest to yourself and look at the page through the user's eyes and try to answer what is this page about in one sentence without using the word and. It's like, this page is about this running shoe and related products and experience reports from people who bought the shoes. Like, why is this all in one page? Why is this... Or why do you expect this to be treat it as it is about all of these things when it clearly isn't. It is about this one thing and then leads into these other things. How you represent this leading into is up to you. You can hide it behind, or you don't have to hide it. You can just put it lower on the page. You can put it on the sidebar. You can put it behind an accordion. You can put it behind a link that goes to a different page. All of this is fine. It's just then don't expect us to treat this page equally for A, B, and C. Understand that we're treating it as mainly about A. And if A is something that is not useful or not helpful or not good to have in the index from a searcher's point of view, then it probably won't end up in the index, no matter how much B and C and D is there on the page.
Okay, so I have, so I think this concludes this part. I wanted to finish that with something that's going to make your life easier, Martin. Ziemek, if you can show my screen for one more second. So basically, we're working with these problems for last year, and with a tiny exception of what Martin began with. So some kind of Google bugs that we don't really understand and we want. Like I know that LinkedIn, I think, was in the index. Some of the big brands were very vocal about that, including myself with one of our clients. But those are really the edge cases. So with tens or hundreds of websites we analyzed, and actually most of our database, just to make it extremely clear, most of the TGIF with all the indexing issues, those brands, they do that to themselves. We're trying to raise a little bit more awareness to that, but not from Google's end. Obviously, Google could do a little bit more work with diagnosing that, but I know this is difficult. But those are all self-induced. With an example I went through Walmart, through like if you're pushing so much thin content, or if your code is extremely heavy, or if you're blocking half of your domain through blocking JavaScript responsible for half of your layout, this is gonna cause problems. So just to we're basically gonna be pushing Martin with a lot of questions, but with a few exceptions. So those indexing bugs that Google announced, and now I think those are fixed in most cases, or not. I'm not really up to date on this one, but if you have problems, like all of the websites on the screen today we used, all of the brands, they have self-induced indexing problems. And I want to state it extremely, extremely clear, self-induced indexing problems. And those are not even in a lot of cases, not that difficult to fix. So just wanted to end on that note, and Ziemek, roll the questions, unless you want to have a finishing thought from your end, Martin, as well.
I think thank you very much for all this work that you do. B, for having me in this webinar. I think together is a fantastic combination. And C, for these last finishing words, because yes, most of the things are self-induced, and we are looking at it and going like, ooh, okay, how do we work around these in the future? Can we work around these in the future? So we're trying to like protect people from making weird things happen sometimes, but sometimes these protections fail. You can see that with soft 404s. We're trying to protect you if you're giving us an error page without saying it's an error page. Sometimes that doesn't work. And then people are like, why does this not work? And I'm like, well, because we had to guess. You shouldn't make us guess in the first place. But yeah, so that's my last sentence on this one, I think. Questions?
Okay, so we have 2 minutes, so let's go. How to I'm going to read the questions of light. How to deep dive to fix the discovered but currently not crawled, because if URLs are not crawled, they won't be indexed. That's a good question. I'm sorry for you, Martin.
Oh, that's a really good question. That's a question that I get quite often. Discovered not yet crawled means we have ingested it from either a sitemap or we found it on a crawl on a different page and we have enqueued it. The thing is, you don't really have that much control. Like, you don't have full control over our crawl queue for obvious reasons. The thing there is usually there's a few things that can go wrong. One thing is that your site is huge and your crawl budget is low. Crawl budget, there's like blog posts on webmasters.googleblock.com where you can learn more about crawl budget. But fundamentally, one thing that I see happen quite often is that servers give intermittent errors, specifically 500 something. And anything that your server responds to with a 500, 501, 502, 504, whatever, means your server says, hold on, I have a problem here. which Googlebot might interpret as, oh shit, I might be about to push the server over the border and it might fall over any moment. So we are backing off. Whenever we are backing off and your server like responds positively, we are usually like ramping up slowly again. But if you are then having, imagine having like a 500 something response every day, once every day. So like we are seeing this, we are backing off a little bit. We are ramping back up. We're seeing it again. We're like, this is a vicious cycle, as Tomek would, sorry, not Tomek, as Bartosz would say. And that's something that you should look into if your server responds negatively. It can also be that if the sitemap is the only way that we discover this thing, that we then have to guess how important it is. And if we have like 1,000 URLs from you that are all only in the sitemap and we haven't seen them in any of the other pages that we crawled, we might be like, we don't know how important this really is. So they are all these 1,000 are as important as any of the other 999 in the queue for your website. So bad. If you are using them in pages and link to them from your pages, let's say like you have a specific product, instead of just having it in the sitemap, also link to it from other places in your website, so that when we crawl these pages, we see, aha, so this page and this page and this page are all pointing to this product page. So maybe it is a little more important than this other product that only lives in the sitemap. So you can give us a few hints to find out what's happening. But then again, a crawl queue is a crawl queue, and everyone is in a huge crawl queue, really. So maybe we're stuck with somewhere else on the web, but maybe we're just taking a little more time than usual. There isn't like a lot that you can influence, but definitely what you can do is you can check that your server isn't causing us to like back off of your website, and that the way that you announce content to us, or the way that you make content reachable for us isn't flat, doesn't give us a hint on how important something is. You can give sitemaps URLs a priority kind of thing, I think, if I remember correctly, but we ignore that because pretty much everyone just gives everything the priority 1, and then it's like, great, this doesn't help. So yeah, that's that question.
Okay, Martin, I know you have to run.
I actually have time for one more question. We can do one more question.
Shoot,
One more.
Let's do that. Let's do that. Ziemek, I think we need to show a question to Martin, unless this is to Martin as well. Sorry, we're really prepared for a question to Tomek. But Martin, do you want to take this one?
Which one? Oh, okay.
Get around on the screen.
Does it help to incorporate deep schema markup on pages? No. It doesn't help to get around JavaScript impediments.
Okay. What last?
Are you or your team using Puppeteer for some of the Google checking tools or some checks in the GSC? Would you recommend it for monitoring or rendering issues? No, we're not using Puppeteer. We are actually using what we use in the actual indexing pipeline. So the testing tools that we produce use the actual pipeline that Googlebot uses. It's nearly the same. There are a few caveats as well, but for brevity's sake, no, not Puppeteer. Puppeteer, however, is inspired and supported, well, not supported, but like a bunch of stuff that the web rendering service implemented and built for the evergreen Googlebot is in Puppeteer. So Puppeteer is a good way of getting a feeling for how Googlebot would potentially render things. If you see an error in your Puppeteer script, that doesn't mean that Googlebot suffers the same problem. You have to use the official testing tools to get that exact result, but you get an okay approximation, I would say.
Just to build on that, Christo, next week we're gonna have an in-depth webinar, something we were supposed to have today, but we're lucky enough to have Martin joining us, where we're gonna have like 1.5 hour, maybe up to 2 hours of all the data we discovered. We just didn't have the time for that today and in the last conference. Anyhow, Martin, we really hope you're gonna join us in the next webinars. We're gonna talk about that a little bit more, because awesome. This topic of indexing and rendering, it requires more attention. And I'm so grateful, and I'm saying that from the bottom of my heart, I'm so grateful that you picked up this conversation, that you actually are helping us out and going that extra mile. We're going to stay here for a few more questions. We're going to let Martin enjoy the rest of his day. And again, thank you so much, Martin. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. And also the questions that were asked, I'm hoping that I might get them after this webinar so that I can probably like write a blog post or something on that as well. Awesome.
We're collecting all of the questions from today and sending them over to Martin.
Awesome.
Ask about domain authority.
Oh God, okay.
Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Have a great
again,
day.
Martin.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, that was really nice to talk about those problems with Martin. Now, if we have some of the questions to Tomek, because we need to warm Tomek up a little bit. And again, Tomek, our head of research and development. Tomek, go. For an e-commerce website with most of its content only available after rendering, do you see pre-rendering as a short-term solution, and would we aim for hybrid rendering? I love this question. Tomek, go.
Bartek Guralewicz wrote a post. I don't remember the name. Why?
I'm searching for it, and you can ask that.
Why pre-rendering isn't a good solution in most of the cases? Because basically the problem with pre-rendering is that you have different versions that search engines, so it's difficult to troubleshoot issues. And in general, if you can afford that, hybrid rendering is much better.
Yeah. So as Tomek said, I pasted the link to my slide share from SMX East, I think 2 years ago. Anyhow, with working with very large structures that are doing pre-rendering, we were very excited about that a few years back, maybe 3-4 years ago. We were very excited about some of our clients implementing pre-rendering until we saw how much extra work it produces. And we're gonna use, for example, an example of discus.com. Discus was one of my favorite case study where they were serving only four lines of code, so HTML body HTML, to Google for a few months before they realized that their pre-rendering is broken. So users would see a regular website, but Google would see just 4 lines of code. So obviously pre-rendering is okay, but it generates a lot of extra work, and you need to have a very tech-savvy and JavaScript SEO-savvy team to first of all crawl those two websites, compare those. You need to have the same website graph for both websites, so pre-rendered one and the client-side rendered one, which is sometimes I wonder if it's worth all that extra work, but I know this is something, sometimes you have to do that, but just try to keep it as short as possible. Okay, any extra questions? Oh, that's interesting. Tomek, do you want to take that? Or?
Okay, so basically, if I understand your question correctly, you are asking us if particular section like news are crawled and rendered more frequently, right? Okay.
I would understand that as well.
Okay.
So I would assume, just to make it clear, Tomek, I would assume that the question is if you're, for example, CNBC, you're like skipping the line.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That was just nod your head if we're correct. But yeah, sorry, Tomek.
Okay, as we mentioned previously, rendering and crawling are very interconnected, and crawling is very tightly referred to the thing how frequently a web page is changing. So basically, if Google see that okay, the news section is very frequently changing, they may prioritize that section, and it's called it's according to the patents, it's per URL and per section. So yes.
So something I do at Onely, that's part of my job. I will simplify what Tomek just said. And the thing is that basically we're seeing a lot of publishers with a lot of their content not in index. So I think that CNBC is one of the very interesting case studies, or a lot of other publishers in our database, where Google is treating publishers, regardless of how important the piece of the news is, the same. And we have articles at Medium with hundreds of links that are not indexed. So you will see that this is fairly fair at Google in this department, because regardless of your authority, if your website is too heavy to render, or for some reasons, those heuristics that Martin mentioned are showing that parts of that page is not as important, they will skip that. And we're seeing that we actually had those examples in one of the previous presentations. We're seeing a lot of big brands, popular articles, not in Google's index for like 2 or 3 years. So, so this is, yeah, no good news here. Sorry. Okay, do we have another one? Oh, switching for pure, in your experience, is switching from pure JavaScript server-side rendering to full client-side rendering have a high impact on indexing and rankings? Oh, it's the other way around. So you're switching from, so just to translate that again for non-technical people, if you have an HTML website, because it's server-side render, if you have an HTML website and now all of a sudden you have a JavaScript-powered website, so it requires more computing power to crawl and, sorry, not crawl, to render and index, will that have an impact on indexing and rankings? And the short answer is yes. We're seeing that more and more JavaScript-powered websites are somehow ranking well, but those are still exceptions. So if you rely on client-side rendering, you're taking a very strong chance, I would say 70–80%. Tomek, how is the data on this one, that your content may not be indexed?
In the case
JavaScript-powered content.
So 30% after one month.
So after 2 weeks, 40% of the JavaScript content in our database of like top websites is not indexed. So yeah, that's the correction. 30, 40, 45% of the JavaScript powered content is not indexed after 2 weeks. So this is still bad. Okay, let's move forward. Amazing question, Gazi, and I replied to that in the chat before, but that's what I was actually trying to ask Martin about. And I know this is tricky because if Google would start showing all of the bunch of URLs that are not indexed by their decision, oh, I wouldn't like to be in Martin's shoes. That would be tough. But in general, there is no tool set towards that. We have our own tool set, so the Google Indexing Forecast that we somehow manually curate, but it takes tremendous amount of work to first of all build it, then scrape it, because Google is making it more and more difficult. So we have a lot of fallback solutions for scraping because the site command is difficult. So for just one URL, you can use the site and comment command. I'll just write it down.
Plus the URL inspection tool for just one URL.
And you can use site inspection tool as well. But if you want to check it on scale and if your page is in thousands or millions of URLs, there is no tool set for that right now, unless we figure this out how to make TGIF accessible to the public. But it's just a lot of manual work. Okay. Does lazy loading? Oh, that's Tomek's topic. Tomek.
Basically, that shouldn't affect Google, but the best is to ask Martin for that.
So in general, with images, rendering engine is not looking at so the batch optimized rendering and fetch batch optimized render and fetch architecture. So part of the web rendering service, WRS. I always get that shortcut wrong. Anyhow, they don't look at the full images. They look only at image dimensions. And if you have lazy loading, as far as I know, I might be not up to date on this one because it changes sometimes. They look at the specific viewport. So they will have like an X amount of pixels long page, and they will see, okay, if you fit within those, let's say 3000 pixels. I don't remember. I know that John Shetata did an experiment on this one from Condé Nast. If you fit within those viewport, they will just look at the viewport because Google is not scrolling. So Google doesn't scroll, they look at the viewport. And I'm 100% sure this was right the end of last year. Maybe something has changed. I'm not sure on this part, like 100%, but we can double check. Okay. Is there a way to, Tomek, do you want this one?
That's a very interesting
Is
question.
there a way to understand if URL log data is in crawling on the rendering phase? So you wanna know, I'm guessing the question is from Hari, that if Googlebot visited a URL and they know that from server logs, what's happening to this URL? And the short answer is I think you can use URL inspection tool for that. That's going to give you a little bit of insights towards that. But if it's exactly in rendering phase or not, you won't have that information, unfortunately.
You will have information if it's after crawling and after rendering. So you don't have that in the middle part. The best idea is to, just as Bartek said, the URL inspection tool and see the rendered HTML. This will show you the current state of the page. And you cannot get that information from log files because of Google politics that they want to cache a lot of things. So you will see, okay, there was no request for .js, but in fact, Google was using cache. So there is no point in doing that.
So we could go in depth into how batch optimized rendering architecture does that, because they don't use the real time. They only fetch all of the resources, and it might be that your URL data. So for example, your URL, like let's say domain.com/product1, this was requested, but they're still waiting for JavaScript and for CSS, for image dimensions. So it's not happening as we imagined it does. When Google crawls URL, it goes straight to rendering. They need to fetch all of the resources first, which takes some time. We don't know how much. So I would look into that a little bit as well. Okay, yeah, let's go with the next question. Not exactly related to rendering, but according to your experience, can disavowing backlinks help with rankings? Meaning, if you manage to remove the noise, would Google love index you more? So I was always on the disavow team. We clean up our clients' link profiles quite a bit if there are, especially for older websites, because I guess in 2010 and 2012, there wasn't that much of white hat going on. So we still use disavow. We have a team within Onely that's doing disavows, but we're not seeing that much, these many problems with bad links as we used to. So we still advise our clients to do that, but we don't push them as much because we know that Google is somehow, year over year, we're seeing that Google is a little bit more laid back with links. So I would do that, and if I would have time, I would create a disavow to have a spotless backlink profile. We do have that at onely.com. Okay, let's continue. How much speed of the website affects the index factors? Is Google PageSpeed? Oh, that's a wonderful question. Is Google PageSpeed a good tool for me to base on count of the resources to render? So first of all, try. We will cover that in depth next week at the Geeky in-depth webinar. And I think Tomek is very eager to answer this question.
Now or next week?
Yes, you can
Okay.
briefly just cover that.
Basically, of course, Splitt is ranking factor. So that's the first part of the answer. Second, crawling is very related to the host load and the speed that the page is returned to Google. I wouldn't call exactly that Google PageSpeed is a good tool for that, but basically this is a part of solving the issue. If you see that something is okay, that your website is terrible in Google PageSpeed, that's a good starting point for improving your web.
So the beef we're having with the PageSpeed tool is that it doesn't show you the actual speed. It shows you the points or whatever, so it doesn't show you how critical rendering path is going around that, what's the CPU cost or processing cost around that URL. So if you wanna investigate, and Tomek, correct me if I'm wrong and you are here, if you wanna diagnose if your URL is gonna be rendered properly, I would go into Chrome Developer Tools. We have a video about that, that walkthrough I recorded last week. Ziemek, maybe you could paste that in the chat. You need to emulate, this is gonna get geeky for just a second, you need to emulate how batch optimized rendering architecture is looking at your page. So you need to remove all of the images, all of the scripts like ads or tracking scripts, and then see how your website's rendering is affecting like scripting time, rendering time, and so on. And I can go on about this topic for probably half an hour. So just join our webinar next week. I'm worried that we're going to lose half the audience, but we can continue with questions. I'm going to read it. Tomek, just raise your hand if you want to answer that. From recent experience, I've seen page speed goes hand in hand with rendering JS-heavy pages. What's the best way to convince developers of the seriousness of this particular issue? I love this, Christine. I love this question. Tomek, should I, or do you want to?
You can do it.
Okay, so first of all, getting developers on the same team. We join, like at Onely, we join development teams of our clients. So if we work with, let's say, domain.com, we join their development team. And when we start to talk to them about web performance, about critical rendering path, how this all affects both rendering and crawling, because what you said here is partially or fully correct, they usually get excited about this quickly. The biggest problem is to get a buy-in from someone who's assigning their budgets or their focus, which is also something, if you explain that, if you talk to the decision makers, the CTO, or sometimes CEO, depending on the company size, that's usually very, we're very successful with getting them on the same page. But just to answer your question directly with the JS heavy pages, so page speed is a little bit of a vague or not precise metric, but JS heavy pages, if you look at the critical rendering path, it's the same. Critical rendering path optimization is very similar to what you have to do to index and render your pages with Google. So I'll keep it here. We're gonna cover this part next week a little bit more in depth. But if you have a JS heavy page that's very fast, most likely all of the critical and main content is served without dependencies or heavy dependencies on scripting. Okay, continue. Mateusz, this is difficult because what we do at Onely, we use write.com and we crawl them with all 4 options. So desktop, mobile, desktop JS, desktop JS, desktop Node.js, mobile crawl without JavaScript, and mobile crawl with JavaScript. So we try to look at that one website from all 4 angles. So again, desktop crawl with JavaScript enabled and disabled. And we're looking if website graph is going to change, because first of all, comparing JS to non-JS is going to show you if you have JS dependencies to your content, but also comparing desktop to mobile is going to show you how your mobile version is affecting your link graph. So if some of the links, some of the internal links are removed by the mobile version. So I would go with, out of those 2 tools, Screaming Frog and Sidebulb. I love those tools. They're very cool, but they're both not cloud-based. So it's a little bit more complex to see duplication data and so on. So I would go with Write or Deepcrawl or Spotify or one of those to have a little bit more data. Because we use Screaming Frog, we love both Screaming Frog and Sidebulb, but yeah, the cloud-based crawlers like Write and Deepcrawl give you that extra layer of information. Benjamin, how many milliseconds of scripting is fine for the Googlebot? At what point it says goodbye, no more scripting today? Oh, I love this question. So first of all, Benjamin, I'm guessing it's a Polish first name, so Benjamin, this is a very good question because we just had this conversation with Tomek. And Tomek, do you want to take this one?
I already answered that question on chat.
Oh, you did. So there's no hard threshold, but what we're seeing, what is still a wild theory we're trying to prove or disprove, is that scripting seems to be more difficult to Google, something that they avoid more often than rendering. I'm not sure if this is what you wrote down in the chat, Tomek. I hope we're on the same page. We usually are. Okay, continue. Barry Schwartz, I love this question. So Barry
51.
is very famous for his PBN. No, obviously Barry is joking. So obviously links, they don't have that much to do, but just to make something serious out of this question, I would love one day like an in-depth webinar into how domain authority is measured, because this is one of those informations. Like, what is this info I cannot find? But anyhow, even if you have a lot of links, you will struggle with both indexing and rendering, and we have tons of examples like Medium with 20%. Yeah, Tomek, 20%. I always get percentage wrong.
25,
so how many?
25.
So yeah, Medium.com with 25% of their articles or their pages, their URLs not indexed in Google. So the authority and the amount of links is not a solution, unfortunately. Just to answer one question from the chat, Philippe, the tools are right.com, like the all-star team, product placement, and deep crawl or Botify or on crawl. There are quite a lot of those. We use right the most, but we love deep crawl as well. So both those are amazing. Okay, I think we should wrap this up. Okay, answer this question. I think we should wrap this up because, first of all, thanks to all of you for coming. We didn't expect so many of you today, which is amazing that we can talk about those problems around indexing, about rendering. We're going to have a little bit more time next week. I think the webinar is going to be Thursday. We're going to go through more of our research, more of the things that we didn't publish last week at the Search Engine Journal eSummit because we only had 20 minutes. Next week, we're going to geek out with Tomek and Sevi from our team, and we're going to have 1.5 to 2 hour long webinar. We're going to try to make it as accessible as possible, but this is going to be a bit more Tomek oriented.
More coffee.
With his you're going to need a lot of more caffeine for next week. We're going to have a deep dive into a lot of technical problems. Oh yeah, my dog woke up. Thank you. Show yourself. So thanks so much once again, and see you. I'll hopefully see you next week. Tomek, any finishing words?
Thanks for coming and see you next week.
Oh, such a copycat. Thank you very much, guys.
Copycat.